You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Washington has abruptly ordered Beijing to close its consulate in Houston.
The United States said the Chinese consulate general in Houston conducted activities incompatible with their status. This is an entirely malicious slander.
On Wednesday, the U.S. State Department ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston.
And the move has brought swift condemnation from China and a threat of retaliation.
China has retaliated. China has asked the U.S. to shut down Chengdu consulate.
There was even that report from the South China Morning Post that said that China may close the consulate in Chengdu because of its strategic value and because of its proximity to Tibet.
Hello and welcome to the US-China trade war update. I'm Finbarr Bermingham on the political economy desk here at the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. It's another podcast in exile this week. We are in the midst of a third wave of coronavirus outbreaks here in the city, and distancing measures are back with a vengeance. But that doesn't stop the news from washing over us like waves on the deck of the Titanic. What a week, what a month, what a year. On Wednesday, the United States said it was going to close the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas, a hugely symbolic move, with the State Department saying it was because China had been stealing intellectual property. More legislation, meanwhile, is moving through the US government to punish China for all sorts of alleged misdemeanours. Things are really heating up. Here in Hong Kong, the fallout from the Autonomy Act continues to reverberate. We will be talking with Hong Kong news editor Denise Tsang in the first half of the show to get a sense of how it's being viewed by Hong Kong exporters, big US multinationals here in the city, as well as local government officials. Denise's team have been doing heroic work on the front lines of Hong Kong's roller coaster year of news. It's great to have her back on the show, along with old faithful John Carter, political economy editor, who will break down the rationale behind the closing of the consulate in Houston and mull China's possible response. In the second half, we'll be joined by William Marshall. Will is a veteran trade lawyer here in Hong Kong, friend of the show, who has been dealing with all things sanctions, tariffs and export controls for many, many years. William's phone has no doubt been ringing off the hook, with people in Hong Kong worried about these sorts of trade barriers that they've never had to deal with before. We're glad he can join us, and he's going to break down all these terms and what they mean in the grand context of the spiralling US-China trade war. On with the show. Delighted to be joined today on the podcast by political economy editor John Carter and Hong Kong news editor Denise Tsang. Denise, it was about a year ago now that you and I took a trip up to the border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. We spent some time with truck drivers in a cafe that has subsequently, unfortunately, closed down, and we were asking them about the fallout from the trade war. We were speaking in particular to one gentleman called Bill Kwok, and he used the Cantonese term moloi to describe his situation. I remember you telling me that the translation is something like helplessness. And I wonder, when you think about everything that's happened over the past couple of weeks, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, national security law, the ongoing trade war, the coronavirus outbreak, this sort of sentiment must be very common among businesses and just ordinary people in Hong Kong right now.
Yes, Finbarr. And that sense of being moloi, of being helpless, is even worse at this time because of a combination of the factors you just mentioned. And in Hong Kong, the trade has been down for more than 10% last year because of the trade war. And then for other sectors like retail, food and beverage, and tourism, and even hospitality, they all suffer across the board because of the COVID-19 pandemic and also the recently escalating tensions from the US-China.
Yeah, you and your team have been doing some fantastic coverage over recent weeks. You had a great story this week where you were speaking with exporters in the city who are very worried about the change of Hong Kong's trading status that is likely to come with the Hong Kong Autonomy Act and the executive order that President Trump signed last week. Tell us, Denise, what these exporters are thinking. What are they telling you right now?
Well, one of the key terms that will change Hong Kong is that the tariffs the U.S. has imposed on China exports during the trade war they will be applied to Hong Kong because of the now Hong Kong now is aligned with China. So that means made in Hong Kong exports for the US will be subject to the same tariffs. I heard some exporters, they moved to Hong Kong, back to Hong Kong last year to avoid the tariffs. But then now they suffer losses because of this changing status. So that means they have to pay tariffs here, and also it doesn't have any. It will suffer some losses as a result.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real fascinating thing that companies were moving back to Hong Kong because it's very expensive here, of course. It's not really a great place to be a manufacturer because of the overheads. What sorts of sectors are you seeing that in, Denise? And I guess they're going to have to find a new place to go now.
Yes, those sectors that will be like garment making, but of course, they have to be very high end with very high margin products. Otherwise, it can't really offset the high rent in Hong Kong and other wages and other costs as well. So what I heard was garment makers and some high-end watch makers or some processing parts of the exports can be done in Hong Kong.
Yeah, we had the Autonomy Act last week. The European Union is planning retaliation also. Do you get a sense that people and business leaders and exporters and the community in Hong Kong is still shell-shocked, or has this been fully digested yet?
Yes, they're still digesting the news. The thing is, they need more details, the terms for enforcement. They're very cautious about the rest of this year. And also they're trying to figure out what sort of risk they can mitigate out of this. So some of them are thinking exploring other major markets in addition to the US, such as the mainland China. But then there are many people, many exporters trying to plug into the mainland market, which is so different from the US or even EU. They have difficulties and even they made much losses. So now they're thinking whether this is the right time to get back to the mainland market or even to ASEAN, because ASEAN has got a free trade deal with Hong Kong.
Yeah. And John Carter, bring you in here. Last week, Hong Kong was the big story. It's still massive, but I don't know about you, but I feel like the news is being overtaken every half hour or something. Yesterday, which was Wednesday, we had the news that the Chinese consulate in Houston was going to close down. It was being closed down by the American government in response to alleged industrial espionage and stealing intellectual property, according to the US State Department. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that? What does this signify in terms of the US-China relation? Has this trade war, so to speak, spiraled totally out of control?
Well, it certainly reinforced the perception that we're in a new Cold War. I mean, this is by far the most severe or serious diplomatic incident in the continuing escalation of US-China relations, and it was totally unexpected and it was a shock to everybody, I think. And there's a number of theories why, one of which is that given how badly Trump is doing in opinion polls for the November election, that his administration is accelerating their efforts to punish China, for lack of better words, while they still can. And there's more to come in the coming months because they figure they won't be in office for very much longer.
This is a rumour mill in full churn at the moment, and this is certainly something that's been doing the rounds. The Trump administration is trying to, as you say, squeeze as much stuff anti-China, as much punitive action into the next few months as it can. But what can China do in response to this? We talked last week about how with Hong Kong it was kind of restricted, but what are we expecting as a retaliation?
Well, we're running a story this afternoon that China will close the U.S. consulate in Chengdu in Sichuan province, which is important because it's the westernmost U.S. consulate and covers the western part of the country, including Xinjiang and Tibet and Chongqing, where there are a lot of big U.S. manufacturers. And our sources are telling us this is the Chinese retaliation, proportional, not one of the big consulates, but an important one, and it will hurt the U.S. Just as closing of the Houston consulate has hurt China. There was a report overnight, by the way, that the U.S. considered closing the San Francisco consulate for China, but that was considered to be too provocative. There are lots of Chinese in the greater San Francisco area in California who use the San Francisco consulate to get visas to go back home. And so this was considered to be too much, too far, where Houston was described by one source as quote unquote low-hanging fruit, and that was why Houston was closed.
And Denise, you're very well plugged into the American business community here. There was a ripple of anxiety, I think, yesterday that Hong Kong might be where the axe falls on this. What's been the sort of conversations you've been having with American business figures in Hong Kong over recent days?
Well, I have spoken with a couple of them, and then they all feel a bit worried about the national security law and also the escalating tensions between US and China. And AmCham in Hong Kong has done a survey on its members, and it also said almost all of them are worried about the situation, and all of them need to know more about the details of the law so that they can plan for their business and whether the strategies will be taken in the future. Mm-hmm. So overall, it's not very good. I mean, in terms of sentiment, because there's so many uncertainty and questions unanswered. And it's like 2 days ago, I came across a survey by the Japanese consulate general in Hong Kong. They've polled like 600 Japanese companies in Hong Kong, and it's like similar result with AmCham. Most of them, they are concerned about or very concerned about the national security law on its business. And then more than one third of them was considering withdrawing from Hong Kong or shrinking the functions of their offices in Hong Kong, while a similar extent of Japanese companies are thinking staying put. So I think now is a period of uncertainty for investors in Hong Kong.
You mentioned earlier that in the Japanese survey that some of those businesses are perhaps making plans to reduce their functions in Hong Kong or leave Hong Kong. Are you getting that sense as well from Western, particularly American companies, that we might see an exodus because of the current situation?
Well, I think this is quite uncertain right now. I think many companies are in a stage of considering. They may not take actions yet because things are still hazy, and they are looking for more information and details on how that law will be enforced and the consequences of the law will be on business. So for now, I haven't seen an exodus of American companies from Hong Kong. After all, it really depends on where the companies want to do business with. If they want to do business with China, I think it really makes sense, to station the companies in Hong Kong. So it really depends on what these companies are going to do with their future plans and where its main market will be. So it's still up in the air.
Absolutely. Very worrying times. And Denise, I just wanted to ask you about Hong Kong officials. Is there a ripple of anxiety going through the governmental society in Hong Kong, that members of the LegCo or even members of the government about where these sanctions might land?
Well, obviously there are two camps of views. For the pro-government camp, they all feel very positive and they don't have much worries. They even see the security law will bring peace to Hong Kong and cramp down violence that we've seen during the protests in the past few months. But of course, the pro-democracy camp will just flag that the national security law will curb freedom in Hong Kong, like freedom of information flow and democracy development. And even they say that, the democratic development will be a setback as a result of this law. So, and also they're concerned about the autonomy given by the one country, two system principle will be eroded. So I think there are many different views in the market, but I think the sanctions will definitely be negative on Hong Kong because obviously the special treatments stipulated by the Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992, they were cancelled.
And John, simultaneously to this, we have a whole absolute plethora of action going on in America towards China. Number of pieces of legislation moving through the chambers. Tell us about this trend towards delisting Chinese companies from US stock markets. I mean, we've heard of, actually over recent days that there may be some of these going to relist in Hong Kong. But what do you think's behind that, and what does it mean for big Chinese corporations?
One of the main issues is accounting standards, and Chinese companies who list in the U.S. following at least some of the rules that the U.S. requires of U.S. companies. And this has been controversial. It was particularly controversial after Luckin Coffee, the scandal involving Luckin Coffee, where top executives were shown to have faked sales numbers, significantly faked sales numbers, just a year after Luckin went public in America. And so there was a rising call, and this is one of a series of Chinese companies that have had scandals, have been shown to have been dishonest with their disclosures. And this has led for a call in Congress for, at the very least, for Chinese companies to follow American standards. On top of that, you have this anti-China sentiment that says kick them out of the country, and you force Chinese countries to delist from stock exchanges. That's unlikely to happen because of the impact that would have not only on the Chinese companies, but on their U.S. partners and on the stock exchanges themselves. It could precipitate a financial crisis. And so despite the rhetoric in some quarters, that's unlikely to happen. Having said that, the fear is there. It's created the sentiment among certain companies that Americans are anti-China to the point where they don't want to come to America to list their companies. And they're looking to Hong Kong and they're looking to Shanghai to do it rather than do it in America. And that is potentially America's loss, but we'll see. I would note that the STAR market, which is part of the Shanghai exchange, just celebrated its first anniversary, and a lot of Chinese tech firms who might otherwise have chosen to list in America are listing on that exchange in Shanghai.
It certainly looks like a bifurcation there, or decoupling is the common parlance these days. Denise, you've been working on the Hong Kong desk at SCMP for many years now. Did you ever think that you would be reporting on a situation like this? And is there a sense that Hong Kong sort of is caught in the middle here between these two worlds?
Yeah, I've never seen this type of things during my career in journalism. And it looks like now the tensions between the US and China are getting even worse. And Hong Kong has never been sandwiched or even caught in the middle of such type of crossfire for a long, long time. And I think the most disappointing thing is Hong Kong is such a free and open economy and is so vulnerable to any trade disputes. So I'm not sure when Hong Kong can get back to its feet. And it looks like it's getting worse only.
Denise, John, before we finish, is there anything that we should look out in terms of economic numbers in the week ahead from Hong Kong or from mainland China?
Yes, all eyes will be on the GDP figures for the second quarter in Hong Kong, which the government is due to announce next Wednesday. The second quarter's performance is expected to be even worse than the first quarter. So now we're even getting worse for the second quarter because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And basically Hong Kong was grinding to a standstill. So all the economists are thinking the second quarter's GDP will be even worse than the first quarter, and we won't see any significant recovery until the end of this year.
Wow, okay. John, how about over the border?
Yeah, next Friday, the 31st, we will get the latest Purchasing Managers Index. This is a sentiment survey of manufacturers, service sector firms, and construction firms, how they see the current economic environment and how they see the outlook. People will be watching closely to see whether the sentiment will build on the important gains in the second quarter, particularly the stronger than expected growth in second quarter GDP of 3.2%. and within manufacturing, people will be taking a quick look at the export orders sub-index. In other words, are export orders continuing to increase, or are they contracting again? And that's very important because we know, because of the problems in the United States and the continued subdued economy in Europe, that a lot of demand for Chinese goods, export goods, has declined. And so what is the outlook for that? Exports are about 17% of the Chinese economy. So it's important if exports are going to increase, that would increase the overall economy.
Absolutely. We will stay tuned and talk about this again next week. John Carter, Denise Tsang, thank you very much for joining me. And we're going to be joined on the line by the SCMP's in-house China economic/political historian, Zhou Xin, who's going to talk us through the absolute historical significance and resonance of the US deciding to close the Houston consulate this week. Zhou Xin, thanks for joining us. Symbolic day in US-China relations, symbolic week. We've had the US close down, will order the Chinese government to close within 72 hours the consulate in Houston, Texas. This was the first Chinese consulate in the US. And Zhou Xin, tell us a little bit about the history there. What's the symbolism and how is this viewed in China?
Well, I mean, this is possibly the biggest development in the Sino-US relationship in the last decades. And the China side was furious, was so angry. And as I said, China will retaliate. And it's so dramatic. You see the video footages of Chinese diplomats burning confidential documents in the courtyard, and then the fire trucks were waiting outside the courtyard. It's like a movie. It's like a spy movie, and in this surreal. So I think this is a goes really to a new level of hostilities. I mean, kicking out of diplomats or shutting down consulates is usually seen as kind of, something happened only before real military conflicts. And also, China was really angry about, the U.S. is saying that this consulate has been involved in, intellectual property theft, but there was no hard evidence. So China is demanding the U.S. to giving specifics, giving the evidence how this consulate has been involved in these kind of alleged activities.
Mm-hmm. We've seen, we're expecting some retaliation from China. We're speaking on Thursday afternoon. We've reported at the SCMP that China is mulling a closure of the US consulate in Chengdu. Would that be seen to be sort of even-handed, Zhou Xin? Are they seen as sort of equivalent, the Houston and Chengdu consulates?
Well, I think there are lots of speculations going on, but I think Chengdu, as SMP reported, is the most likely result. Because yesterday, Reuters reported that Wuhan, the U.S. consulate in Wuhan might be closed. Well, this is reasonable in the first take, because Wuhan is relatively small, and due to the coronavirus, most of the diplomats have been pulled out, have left the consulate. So it's only a skeleton left there. So if China shuts it down, it's the impact would be minimum, but also given kind of a symbolism that China is also doing something. But today, SMP reported that the Chengdu one will be closed, and that's more interesting because the Chengdu is more important than Wuhan, at least for now. And also, Chengdu is covering, Chongqing, Sichuan, and even Tibet. So it's very, very interesting. Basically, this consulate covers the whole southwestern part of China. It is very important. It's more of a kind of eco. And also, if China really shuts it down, it shows like Beijing is not going to step back in this tit-for-tat retaliation. Yeah. And also, more interestingly, the Chengdu consulate of the United States has a special role in China's history, as we all remembered in a few years ago. Wang Lujing, the former vice mayor of Chongqing, defected to the Chengdu consulate and tried to, after his bloody fallout with Po Xilai, he tried to tell the United States how Bo Xilai and his wife has murdered this British businessman, and then all the materials are being handed all the way to Washington when Hilary Clinton was still the state secretary, included in her book. And this kind of incident has become kind of watershed moments, or possibly one of the most important moments in Chinese history. The following years have been permanently changed because of that. So the Chengdu consulate of the United States was in kind of spotlight of the global media coverage and at the center of history. And now we are going to see maybe this one is going to be in spotlight of history again.
Yeah. With regard to the change in Chinese history, you're referring there to was that like a fork in the road after which we saw the demise of Bo Xilai and the rise of Xi Jinping?
Yes, you can. In some way, you can say this because we all know that Bo Xilai is a potential opponent or challenger to Xi, and then his downfall certainly helped the rise of President Xi.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, Zhou Xin, about while we're on the historical symbolism, tell us about the historical symbolism of the Houston consulate and how, that strikes me as a real sort of going for the jugular in a sense, because it was the first consulate to be established after the normalization of US-China relations, and that to me has real symbolism.
Well, it is, because by that time, I think the president is Jimmy Carter. So, China going a little bit southwards to that. Because by that time, of course, the bilateral exchanges, personal exchanges and trade are very little. But this opening a new consulate in Houston is certainly a goodwill. And it shows that the bilateral relationship is going to become better and better. There will be more exchange of people, more exchange of trade. And now the closure of it certainly give us a very strong signal that the United States side is not willing to see the returning or the normalization of the exchanges even after the coronavirus. So it's very worrying. And also, Houston is a very special city, United States city for Chinese audience, because Yao Ming, the
yes.
famous basketball player, played there for a few years. So Houston is actually, of course, New York and Washington are better known in China, but Houston is also has kind of psychological attachment to Chinese people. When the United States decided to close the consulate there, it has a huge, not only from Chinese foreign ministry, but also the backlash or the outcry from the general public is also very loud.
Oh dear, it seems like we're really on a precipice of something very great here. Zhou Xin, great to have your analysis. Thanks as ever.
Thank you, Finbarr.
Joined on the line by William Marshall, who is a trade lawyer with Tsang & Partners. That's PwC's Hong Kong law firm. Will is an expert on trade sanctions, tariffs, export controls. He's just told me off mic that he's been doing this sort of thing for 23 years. So we're glad to have him on here. Won't give away too much about how old you are there, Will, but in the past few weeks we've seen Hong Kong really come into the limelight here. I guess a lot of the work you've done in the past has been in Hong Kong, but not really concerning Hong Kong. But we've had headline trade actions, tariffs, export controls and sanctions all come into play after the US unveiled its Autonomy Act, as well as Donald Trump's executive order removing Hong Kong's special status. So Will, I guess this is sort of new territory for Hong Kong, and how is this sort of feeding into what you're doing? Are you getting many people very worried about this who haven't perhaps had to deal with it in the past?
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Finbarr. Actually, a lot of clients are extremely worried about it. I think more importantly is no one's quite sure how it's going to commercially impact them, even with respect to export controls, which we can talk about more in detail in a moment, I guess, but is more substantively and more obviously impactful to clients in the high-tech space or telecom space. But even those companies are not quite clear how, when, and whether the enforcement actions will follow the executive order that was issued recently by Trump. So there's still a fair bit of uncertainty from our client base as to what they should be doing, how they should be thinking about their business in Hong Kong, and what sort of concrete steps that they need to be taking to protect themselves going forward.
And export controls, we'll start with that one. I mean, these are all sort of options now for the United States. And because Hong Kong has now, in the eyes of the United States, lost its special status, Hong Kong is vulnerable to the sort of trade action that already is applied to China. Export controls first, will just really basically, what are export controls and why is Hong Kong being pulled into this?
Sure, fair question. So export controls, we can think about it as a method by which the United States and similarly situated countries that are members of the Wassenaar Arrangement, for example, or that follow the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is a multilateral group that controls dual-use technology. So this is strategic technology that can be used for either a military use or a civilian use. And a lot of the technology that we use day to day, whether it's semiconductors or telecommunications or certain types of lasers or encrypted software, could fall under one of the various categories, the 9 categories that are controlled for these strategic trade reasons. The United States has probably the most broad sweeping export controls amongst the Wassenaar Arrangement countries and the countries that follow the Wassenaar Arrangement. And so the United States has extra jurisdictional control on re-exports. So those are even exports of U.S. technology that are shipped from a foreign country to a foreign destination. And the U.S. exercises jurisdiction over those technologies as well in certain circumstances. And so what's happened with Hong Kong is it was classified as a Group A6 country, which is relatively permissive from the U.S. export control standpoint. It is not a Wassenaar member, but it follows the Wassenaar Arrangement. And Hong Kong has implemented a pretty robust strategic commodities control system, which is administered by the Trade and Industry Department here in Hong Kong. And so, Hong Kong has really enjoyed license exceptions and permissive license reviews in those rare circumstances or small category of items that required licenses to Hong Kong. But now with this recent change, Hong Kong is going to be treated as though it is just China, just another city of the People's Republic of China. And so China is a Group D1 country. And so you don't need to know a lot about export controls to realize that D1 sounds like it's a lot worse than A6. And it is. And so China has a number of categories which it does not qualify for license exceptions where Hong Kong did. And now pursuant to statements from the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, and even a little bit more explicitly stated in Donald Trump's executive order, the export administration regulations and the related exceptions that apply to Hong Kong that did not apply to China are no longer available. Yeah. So in other words, Hong Kong is indistinguishable from China as far as U.S. export controls and license application. So I'm not sure I made that entirely clear, but what that really means is what we're really trying to say is that Hong Kong, whereas last month you may not have required a license for nearly everything that shipped to Hong Kong, you will now require a license for many items of dual-use technologies that ship to Hong Kong in the semiconductor space, information security space, and telecommunication space.
Yeah, so basically Hong Kong can import fewer items from the US without a license, sensitive technology. And like, as somebody put it to me a while ago, it's not like missile launchers or, tanks or even supercomputers. I mean, like, in the future, anything but a banana will be a dual-use good because all of these smart devices have got high-powered semiconductors, toasters, Alexa, all this sort of stuff could be in the future in some way considered a sensitive technology. So to be on that D1 list is certainly not a good thing for the society here, right?
Right. And more importantly is I think Hong Kong has begun to carve out a niche for itself within Greater China for research and design in technology and for the distribution or re-export of certain technologies, either in support of manufacturing operations for Hong Kong-based, multinationals, or just simply for the distribution or wholesale of IT equipment, for example. And a lot of that business is so now sort of clouded with uncertainty and perhaps real barriers or blocks to the ease of trade in that business as a result of of Hong Kong's change of status.
Mm-hmm. Sanctions is the next one. Well, this is as a result of the Autonomy Act directly. Export controls predates that, and they're already here. But as I understand it, the Autonomy Act grants the authority to place sanctions on individuals and the banks or financial institutions that fund them or work with them for their role in the unrolling of the national security law. So in reality, what does that mean? Does it mean Carrie Lam's going to be banned from going to the United States, or what are we looking at here?
Well, it could be. So what with respect to specifically the Hong Kong Autonomy Act is that those individuals and officials who are cited as contributing to the degradation of Hong Kong's autonomy, or this the eventuality that has happened with respect to China's more direct control over Hong Kong, those individuals that are named in the congressional report will be sanctioned pursuant to the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And the sanctions, what we really mean there is asset blocking. So any property or assets that are in the United States or in the possession of U.S. persons or entities will be or can be blocked from those officials or individuals. The banks that have significant transactions with those parties will have to also comply with the asset blocks pursuant to the sanctions. And we expect that this may not have broad-based commercial implications, because we don't expect many Hong Kong government officials or PRC government officials to have broad shareholdings or corporate interests in the same way that we saw maybe with the Russian oligarch sanctions a few years ago. But certainly the banks will have some complication in their customer due diligence to determine if and whether they have particular concerns with complying with the orders and whether or not they can identify customer transactions appropriately. So I think the banks are the ones at the moment that are the most concerned. And of course, it's the political implications of it are more significant than the commercial ones at the moment.
Absolutely. The third one in the basket of trade actions is good old tariffs, which we've talked about before on the show. Favorite of Donald Trump, of course. He seems more inclined in the past to use these than sanctions, of course, as we've seen with China. So are we now assuming, Will, that because the Trump administration has removed Hong Kong's special trading status, it is essentially viewed as a part of China? So all those trade war tariffs that we've discussed in the past, do they apply to Hong Kong immediately, or what's the story there?
Right. So the executive order states that it's actually the marking provision that was changed pursuant to the executive order. So it was Section 1304 of the Tariff Act, which is the country of origin marking rules. And so anything that would have been identified as made in Hong Kong previously is now treated as made in China. That has the knock-on effect of applying the Section 301 tariffs that apply to China origin imports into the U.S. also now to what would have previously been considered Hong Kong origin imports into the U.S. And it doesn't, by doing it this way, it doesn't directly impact Hong Kong's separate identity as a WTO member in its own right, or any of the other sort of trading privileges that Hong Kong undertakes as its own customs jurisdiction. Simply, the United States has changed the country of origin marking requirements with respect to Hong Kong, and then therefore those tariffs applicable to China will now also be applicable to Hong Kong as a result.
Yeah. So if I'm making high-end garments or some sort of tech in Hong Kong and I want to sell it to the US, do I now have to, in my factory, change the label to made in China in order to have it recognized at the dock?
Yeah, well, yes, is the short answer. And there is a savings provision there for, goods that were already ordered and being packed for export to the United States. So there is some time to handle the compliance there. But yes, the short answer is that those goods will have to be marked appropriately as made in China.
Wow, I mean that's quite symbolic, right? To if you're a Hong Kong manufacturer and you have to start doing that, it's a bit of a slap in the face.
I think yes, that is bad news. I think the good news is there's exceedingly few items that are actually manufactured in Hong Kong anymore. I think the world has changed quite a lot, and Hong Kong's changed quite a lot from the 1980s and 1970s and before. So those items that are made in Hong Kong are pretty few and far between. Maybe we're talking about samples, R&D prototypes, that kind of thing. So it'll be relatively limited, I guess, for the most part.
Yeah, symbolism, I think. And
yeah, correct.
You mentioned Hong Kong being a WTO member. What does that count for? Do you think Hong Kong's going to bring a case against the US? Would you think that's advisable? Would the US even care about that?
I think the latter question you asked is probably the operative one. I think the WTO as an organization is struggling at the moment. I think that the ability to handle dispute cases of the WTO is compromised, as we all know, at the moment. So I think as a form of redress, the WTO probably doesn't provide a lot of immediate reprieve for Hong Kong. Whether or not Hong Kong has a claim really is rooted in whether or not China has a claim that the Section 301 tariffs are compliant with the WTO agreement, to be honest. So interestingly, Hong Kong's argument is tied up or rolled up along with China's argument against the trade remedies under Section 301. So, is it an appropriate safeguard under the WTO agreement or not?
And I have been speaking to a few people who reckon that maybe Hong Kong could be the proxy for China to bring that case if the tariffs are rolled out, because if they're ruled unlawful against Hong Kong, then it would follow that they're also unlawful against China.
Yeah, correct. If they are unlawful as applied to Hong Kong, then they are automatically going to be unlawful as applied to China, particularly since the U.S.'s position is that the two are indistinguishable as a customs origin. So I think it's an interesting proposition whether or not China pursues that case under the guise of a Hong Kong dispute panel initiation. It'll be interesting to watch that. I'm not sure whether or not that will really be an effective remedy for Hong Kong, just given the time and given the U.S.'s unwillingness or unlikely to necessarily comply. I think the U.S. has had an inconsistent record with respect to its compliance with WTO dispute settlement panels that have not agreed with the U.S. position, right? I mean, if you go back to the Bush administration, there were some arguments on zeroing, for example, of anti-dumping margins. Without going onto that tangent, there were some decisions that went against the U.S. that weren't immediately or quickly complied with. So I think, that is a speculative remedy because of that. Yeah. And even with the structural problems of the WTO all compounded, I'm not sure it's an appropriate remedy. I think the tariffs is probably the least of Hong Kong's issues. I think the export control measures that now apply to Hong Kong in the same fashion that they apply to China is probably the most disruptive to some of the trading and re-export activities that happen in Hong Kong.
Perfect. Well, that's really interesting. Thanks so much for breaking it down, and we'll have you back on the show soon enough.
Thank you, Finbarr.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Thanks for rating, thanks for sharing, and thanks for the feedback that we have been getting. You can follow us at SCMP Economy on Twitter. You can direct the hate mail at FBirmingham. That's FBirmingham with a B-E-R, not like the city. We'll be back here, same place next week. Wash your hands, keep your distance, and please wear a mask.